I hadn't seen the house for over a year before that afternoon. When I did see it, it was nothing but a pile of rubble and ashes. I had lived there most of my life and bought it from my parents when they retired and moved to Florida. They offered to carry the mortgage, but I didn't want them to, so I got a loan from a bank. That way they could have their money in one lump sum and use it to supplement their retirement funds. I wasn't rich by any measure, but as a teenager, had inherited a few bucks from my grandparents. With good advice from my father and his investment counselor, that money grew over the years and I had a substantial down payment, which made getting the loan easier. I liked the house and the neighborhood. My parents took me there after I was born and I went through school while living there. After high school I worked as an apprentice until I had enough experience to take the test to become a licensed electrician. I passed the test and worked on both residential and commercial electrical work before I bought the house. I had several relationships during that time, including one that was long-term and serious. My plan when buying the house was to live there with my wife when I married, and update those parts one thought needed it. That plan didn't quite work out because I met and married Cheryl. We were married for just under 2 years and lived in the house before things went to shit. Some of the movies on TV are feel-good movies. They are written so that they have happy endings, of course. Many of them deal with long-lost loves, or old boy/girlfriends, and, invariably, the lead actor/actress finds herself in a situation where they re-meet an old flame. Again, invariably, the spark is rekindled and their first, and truest, love conquers all. Cheryl loved those movies and watched every one she could find. I only watched enough to recognize the formula of the writing and that all bases were covered by the writers to ensure the eventual happily ever after ending. True life wasn't like that, I tried to tell her. One day we were at our local store Gigantus and ran into Richard Herbert. He hugged Cheryl and she hugged him back. When they were finished hugging and gushing over each other, she introduced him to me as an old friend. After that introduction, it was like I didn't exist. They chatted for several minutes as I stood rocking our shopping cart back and forth and studying the rows of cans of beans on a nearby shelf. I learned that there were at least 4 kinds of pinto beans, a dozen or more kinds of baked beans, for different styles of green beans, pork and beans, lima beans, garbanzo beans, and at least half a dozen other types of beans. While I was studying beans, the two of them were rehashing old times. After my patience had worn a bit thin, I reminded her that we had to be leaving. When I did that, they made a big deal out of exchanging phone numbers and promising to chat soon. I assumed the time they spent chatting in the store was pretty much the last we would see of Richard Herbert. Boy, was I wrong. Cutting to the chase, I found myself in divorce court 4 months later. Irreconcilable differences was the reason she gave for wanting it. I never saw her and Herbert together during those 4 months, never heard a single rumor or bit of gossip that anything was going on between them, and none of our friends ever mentioned the two of them together. It was like a virgin birth where no sex took place, but all of a sudden they were miraculously in love and destined to spend their lives together and in a hurry to get a divorce. In court she never said I was a bad husband or was lacking in any way, she just said that we had irreconcilable differences and she didn't have to define what that meant or give an example of one. The court just seemed to blithely agree they existed and granted the divorce. My attorney told me that Cheryl would most likely get alimony in the house. I was pissed. I'd heard of stuff like that happening, but never thought it would happen to me. It was my house, and had been all my life, and to think that she could live there less than 2 years, get a divorce for no reason other than she was in love with an old boyfriend, and then be given the house. My house. My attorney couldn't make me believe it. No judicial system in the world would allow that to happen. In court I told my story to the judge and thought I recognized some sympathy. Ha! That's when I learned firsthand that the judicial system sucked as badly as I had heard it did. She did, indeed, get the house, but she didn't get alimony. After receiving the decree, I decided to not go near the house again. I made that decision after remembering a country song about a divorced man driving by his old house and seeing the new man mowing the lawn. I had no desire to experience that. Then it burned to the ground, and I sat looking at the ashes. It happened on Thanksgiving Day, and Herbert, I probably don't have to say this, had been living there with Cheryl. He apparently wanted to deep fry a turkey for the holiday instead of roasting it, but it was raining and he couldn't cook it outside, so he tried doing it inside. The newspaper and TV said that sometime during the cooking process, The cooker got turned over and the boiling hot oil made it all the way to the wood-burning fireplace and started a fire that burned the house down before the fire department could put it out. Rumor was that he tripped and knocked the deep fryer over, but nobody confirmed it. I took a final look at the pile of ashes, then drove to my apartment complex and put a frozen dinner in the microwave. While it was cooking, I took out my copy of the divorce decree and read it. Again. It was like doing the same thing over and over the exact same way and expecting a different result. Regardless of how many times I read it, the bottom line was always the same. But that time when I read it, I saw something and started to grin. Then I reread it. After the second reading, the grin became a smile. Umpteen times I had read that fucking document and always ended up depressed, but that time was different. The next few minutes, my smile got bigger as a plan took shape. Maybe the bottom line could be changed after all. The decree didn't mention any alimony, support, or other monies I would have to pay, but it did specify that Cheryl would reside in the house at and gave the address at which it was located, and that I was required to continue making the mortgage and insurance payments on said house. It didn't say for how long, and it never said what happened to the house after there was no longer a mortgage. Or what would happen in the unlikely event the house ceased to exist. After all, whoever thinks about shit like that? I assumed the intent was that I would continue paying the mortgage and insurance and the house would be hers after the mortgage was paid in full, but it didn't specifically say that. It was like the decree was written in a hurry and assumed that everybody knew what it intended to say and strict adherence to that intent would unquestioningly follow. Now, I'm not an attorney and have never played one on TV or anywhere else, so cannot interpret the law, but I can read and generally comprehend what I've read. Also, I'd known all my life that there is both the letter and intent of the law, and I was going to try to exploit the letter even though the intent might be something completely different. The decree required me to maintain insurance on the house, which I had done, so I filed a claim with the insurance company and told them I needed the claim settled post-haste. They asked if I was going to rebuild. I told them no, that I was moving. Since I was the owner of record and there was no evidence of fraud, I picked up a check a week later. That check was for what was left after they paid the bank, and it was enough to make me smile. So my mortgage was paid off, I had a sizable amount of cash, and was the owner of a pile of ashes sitting on a little over 1/4 of an acre of land. I went to the truck I had rented and filled with my belongings. I had also rented a car carrier, hooked it to the truck, and loaded my pickup filled with the tools of my trade onto it. I had gotten several calls and text messages from Cheryl, all of which I ignored. I'd always wanted to visit the Northwest, so that's where I headed. I stopped in the first city across the state line and opened a bank account and transferred my money to that account. I had no idea where I stood, legally, and didn't know if they could come after me in a different state, but I was willing to take a chance or two. I had been afraid to talk to my attorney for fear of what he would tell me, so I figured, what the hell, and never talked with him. The worst that could happen was the court could make me provide her a house, but my argument, weak though it may be, was the divorce decree specified the house at the address. It did not require some house or any house at some address. Since the house no longer existed, I figured I was off the hook. In the event the court wanted to try to enforce, or change, the decree, they'd have to find me. My bet was they didn't care enough to expend the resources. On the other hand, Cheryl would most likely try to force the court to find me. And, of course, if they did, they would have to want to bring me back. Again, my bet was they wouldn't want to, given all the really serious criminals that were out there. It's not like I was a deadbeat dad, because had I been a father, I would never leave my children with nothing. At least I don't think I'm that sorry an individual. I had done nothing wrong. I was a good and faithful husband whose wife re-met an old flame, fell back in love with him, and divorced me because of it. Along the way, the court took the only thing of value I had, gave it to my deserving ex-wife, who then moved her lover in with her, leaving me with a mortgage on a house I would never live in and never own. What a fucked up deal that was for me. I decided to spend that first night in a motel and get an early start in the morning. The motel had a manager's welcome where they served free beer, wine, and snacks for an hour and a half in the evening. The reception area was crowded with other guests, and there were tall, small, round tables scattered around where 2 or 3 people could stand, drink, and enjoy the snacks. One of the tables had just one man standing at it. I joined him. "Hi. I'm Jason Trustel," I said. "Tim Ryan." Do many hotels have free food and drinks? He laughed. About half of the ones I usually stay in do. Do you stay in many? He laughed again. I spend half my life in them. That sucks. Only if you let it. If you like to travel and get laid, it's perfect. I take it you don't. Don't what? Like to travel? Or get laid? I'm pretty sure I know the answer about getting laid, he said, smiling, but I was talking about the hotel. This is my first in several months. Maybe you need to get out more. Wife keep you on a short leash? No wife, so no leash. What brings you to a motel tonight? I spent the next several minutes telling a total stranger about my life and how I ended up chatting with him over beer and chicken wings. So you're basically on the run and hiding. I suppose I am. What happens when they catch you? I don't know. I don't even know what I'm going to do now. Where are you headed? Seattle, I guess. I've always wanted to go there. What are you going to do when you get there? I'm an electrician, so I should be able to find a job. Are you in a hurry to get there? I'm more in a hurry to get away from my ex, her attorney, and any possible court problems. He smiled. Bring your beer and come with me. He led me to the parking lot at the rear of the building. Sitting in the farthest corner sat a bus. It wasn't just any bus, it was a multicolored, shiny behemoth. He unlocked the door and ushered me inside. Holy shit! I exclaimed as I stood looking around. This is fantastic. It was pure luxury, as nice as any picture of any home I had ever seen. Not too bad, eh? He asked. Is this yours? Fuck no. This sucker cost almost $250,000. I could never afford something like this. I'm just delivering it. To who? Or where? From the factory to the dealership. The really expensive ones get delivered directly to the customer at the factory, but the cheaper ones, like this, get ferried to the dealerships and put in inventory. So that's your job? Ferrying these things? That's it. But it isn't just these big, fancy diesel dudes. I also deliver the smaller r/vs, anything that's too big to put on a truck. I pick them up at the factory and take them to whatever dealership they're consigned, drop them off, get on a plane, fly back to the factory and do it again. Ever get tired of the travel? Not so far. I've been doing it for 2 years and haven't paid a month's rent or made a mortgage payment in all that time. That plus the fact that you have no idea how many women see these things parked in these parking lots and want to look inside. Just then the doorbell rang. It had a fucking doorbell. Tim opened the door and there stood 2 women. Hi, said one of them. We saw you get in this thing and wondered if we could look inside. Tim looked at me and smiled. Sure. Come on in. That ringing doorbell led to a night of unadulterated debauchery. The 4 of us romped and played in the bus until early morning. After they left, Tim and I talked. He asked me if I would be interested in doing the same job. If so, he would call his boss and see what he could do. It took me all of 2 seconds to tell him to make the call. It was too early to call then, so we met for breakfast a couple of hours later and he called his boss. I chatted with him and told him my story. He told me to head to the factory and he would see what he could do about a job. Tim and I shook hands and he headed for Chicago to make his delivery and I headed for Texas. During the trip to the factory, I mentally went over the possible advantages of doing the job should I get it. First, it should make it more difficult for Cheryl, her attorney, and the court to find me since I wouldn't have a permanent address. Second, if the night with Tim and the 2 women was any indication, I would be having my share of sex, and third, I'd be saving my salary because the company would be paying all of my expenses, except my car payment and insurance. Then I made a list of disadvantages. It was a short list. Delay in getting to Seattle was the only thing on it, but that didn't carry much weight all else considered. I arrived at the factory in Texas, filled out an application, and was interviewed by 4 people who held various positions with the company. I even went to the local police station to be fingerprinted for a criminal background investigation. I hoped that neither Cheryl nor the court had yet initiated any legal action against me. The next day I spent several hours with the company's safety director. He made a copy of my driver's license and sent it to a company that investigated the work history of drivers for some of the bus and trucking companies in the country. They were trying to make sure that the people who drove their buses all over the country were safe, honest, and reliable. I was safe and reliable, but after what I did to get out of town might not be considered honest. To my credit, I made no secret of how I came to be at their factory looking for a job. Everyone I talked to sympathized with me. The safety director and I went through one of the buses from front to back, side to side, and top to bottom. It was then I learned that they were coaches, not buses, and he and I went through one of them with a fine-toothed comb. 45 feet long, 8.5 feet wide, and weighing over 30,000 pounds, they were impressive. Then he told me to get in the driver's seat and take him for a ride. We started in the big parking lot and graduated to state highways, county roads, and, finally, city streets. The biggest thing I had driven prior to that was a 26-foot rental truck. Some people are born to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs even. Me? I was born to drive motor coaches. I had a ball. Up to then, I had no idea how big the recreational vehicle industry was. My company, I was calling it that even though I had not yet been hired, sent out at least 10 coaches and r/Vs a week to their dealerships all over the country. The average retail cost of their smaller r/Vs was such that they were within reach for lots of people. The retail cost for their coaches, however, ranged from $150,000 to over $2 million. The high-dollar coaches were all delivered to the customers at the factory. High dollar meaning $1 million or more. All others went to the dealership's inventories. At the end of a 3-day process, I was told that I was hired pending the criminal check. I was also told that as of that day they would be paying my motel costs. My criminal check came back clear and I was hired. The next week was spent in the factory watching how the coaches were built and learning all of their systems. I also had to take commercial driver's license, CDL, written and driving tests. During my evenings I studied for the written tests, and during the day I spent time learning what I needed to pass the pre-trip inspection and driving portions of the test. There was a person from the safety office who helped me with those things. I took and passed all the tests and received my CDL. In order to work there, I had to know every inch of the basic models and have working knowledge of the more advanced models and systems. I learned that they could almost drive themselves. In fact, research was being done on that very thing. The owners of the company believed that if cars could do it, why couldn't motor coaches? One morning, Tim Ryan tapped on my shoulder. He had just flown in and would be leaving the next day for Florida with another coach. "Well, what do you think?" he asked. "I don't understand why they have to look for people to do this job. You'd think they'd be standing in line for it. It seems perfect." He chuckled. "It is for some of us, but most find it boring and repetitive after a while. They get tired of the travel and motels and no time at home. Even most truck drivers who have tried it don't care for it. But for you, hell, it should be perfect. It will be like the Foreign Legion, a lost man looking to stay lost and forget his past. People can look for you, but if you don't want to be found, you won't be. The only paper trail for you will be your paycheck, and since it will be direct deposited, even that won't be available to the public or anyone looking for you. You will be using company credit cards for motels, fuel, and food on the road and when you're here. If you only use cash for your daily personal expenses, only you will have no paper trail. If you have any bills to pay, you can even do that through your bank. It's perfect." I had thought of all of those things before and had come to the same conclusion he had. As long as I did nothing stupid like have a traffic accident or use my own credit cards for daily expenditures, I would be invisible. Invisible, that is, until I had to renew my driver's license, and since I had just gotten a new one in Texas, I was good to go for several years. And even if I was traced to Texas, I had no permanent address because the one I used as my residence on my license was a motel. On the other hand, my employer could be traced through my taxes and social security number, but I still couldn't imagine any divorce court in the country going through those machinations. Over a missing ex-husband in a house, but who the fuck knew? Of course, Cheryl might try to insist on it. At any rate, I felt pretty well insulated. Before I left my hometown, I even went so far as to get a burner phone. I transferred the contact information I wanted to keep to that phone and turned my old one off and kept it off. It was my understanding that I could be traced if my old phone was on. I kept it charged and paid the minimum monthly bill, but never turned it on, and only select people, like my parents, knew I had a different one. Overkill? Maybe, but it made me feel more comfortable. 2 days after Tim left, I was told that I was cleared and would leave in the next couple of days for my first trip. I spent the time practicing driving around town in coaches waiting to be delivered. My first coach was one of the lower-end coaches, but still cost more than a lot of houses. The manufacturer's suggested retail price, MSRP, was $196, $572 plus cost of delivery and taxes. I found a storage unit for my things, and turned in the truck I had rented. My pickup would stay in the covered section of the employee's parking lot, so that was taken care of. Sitting in the exposed Texas sun for weeks at a time was not too good on vehicles. I packed a small travel bag, got behind the wheel of the coach and took off. The dealership I was delivering to was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. According to company policy, I could only drive 500 miles per day. That left a lot of time in motels. I could see where the job wouldn't appeal to most. At 500 miles per day, it would take 3 days to get to Philadelphia. My second day on the road took me through my hometown, but it was all interstate, so I wasn't worried. I broke the mileage rules that day because I wanted to get out of my home state. Just in case. I made it to Philadelphia, received a signature and inspection report for the coach, and one of their employees took me to the airport. I couldn't get a flight until the next day, so spent almost 15 hours in the hotel. No women wanted to see the inside of the coach on that first trip. Or the second. Or the third. Things changed on the fourth. I was on my way to Seattle with a $300,000 coach. It was a tad over 2,200 miles, a scheduled 5-day trip, but my boss said I could do it in 4 if I wanted to. I stopped for the night in Salt Lake City. The motel was one that had a manager's welcome with beer, wine, and snacks. It was summer and the welcome was outside next to the pool area. Alcohol was not permitted in the pool enclosure, but the swimmers could come out, eat and drink, and return to the pool. The area overlooked the rear parking lot, and my coach was sitting there all bright and shiny. "Excuse me," said one of the 2 women standing next to the table I was sitting at. I could see the tops of their bathing suits, but the bottoms were covered by the wet towels they had wrapped around themselves. "Yes? Did you drive that bus in here?" I smiled. Maybe my luck was about to change. "Why, yes I did." "Do you live in it?" "I don't." "Could you if you wanted to?" "Absolutely." "Then why don't you? Why do you spend money for a motel if you have that?" "It isn't mine. I'm just delivering it." "Oh? To who? Or is it whom?" "It's neither. It's a dealership where it will be sold." "You mean it's for sale?" "It will be." "Can we look inside?" I smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." We started to the coach, but they stopped long enough to toss their wet towels in a basket provided for that purpose, and grab fresh, dry towels. They didn't wrap the new towels around their waists, but hung them around their necks. I caught a glimpse of small bikini bottoms before I turned and led them to the coach. "I'm Lauren, by the way," said the one who had done all the talking so far. "And this is Kathy," she said, indicating her friend. "Hello, Lauren, Kathy." "I'm Jason." "Hello, Jason," they said in unison. I unlocked the door and indicated they should step inside. "Holy fuck. It's like a palace," said Lauren. "It's like a picture in a magazine," said Kathy. "Who buys shit like this?" I chuckled. "People who want to travel and go camping, but without sacrificing anything like flush toilets and satellite TV. It's called glamping. "Flush toilets?" asked Lauren. "Really?" "Sure. Come here," I said. We had been standing near the driver's seat, but I led them to the bathroom. "Here it is." "Oh wow. Pardon the expression, but can I try flushing it? Sure, go ahead. Wait, is that a shower? She interrupted, her eyes widening. A shower? Can I use it? Just for fun, I want to be able to say I took a shower in a bus. Sure, but I'll have to start the generator and heat the water. It might take a few minutes. That's okay, we'll explore the rest of this bus while you do that. I went to the control panel and pushed a button. You couldn't hear it, but down below, a generator started. I knew there wasn't much fresh water in the holding tank since the factory never filled them, but there was enough for Lauren to take a quick shower. The thought made me smile. For the next few minutes, I showed them around the rest of the coach. Two features amazed them the most, the washer and dryer, and how the mattress in the bedroom raised hydraulically to reveal a hidden storage compartment and built-in safe. We had finished our drinks, and Kathy wanted another, so she left and came back with a full bottle of wine. The bartender likes me, she said, smiling. How long does it take for the water to get hot? Lauren asked. It should be ready by now. Great. May I really do it? Go ahead, but just so you know, the door that separates the bathroom from the rest of the coach isn't fully activated, I lied. We might be able to see you. Who cares, she said, casually tossing her towel onto the bathroom sink. She reached behind to untie her top, and I tried to stay casual as I lifted my glass for a sip of wine. Her top joined the towel, followed by her bottoms. She had no tan lines, so I figured she was comfortable with this sort of thing. How do you turn it on? She asked, standing in front of the controls. I reached in, and the back of my hand brushed against her as I twisted the dial. Cool water shot out, and I watched as she adjusted to the temperature. I continued sipping my wine as the water warmed up. She was only in there for a minute or so, never even using soap. She just wanted to experience it. She reached to turn the water off. Not yet, Kathy called out, then looked at me. May I try it next? Before I could respond, she was already getting ready, following the same routine as Lauren. My thoughts were racing as I tried to stay composed. Like Lauren, Kathy was in there just long enough to get wet before she turned the water off and reached for her towel. They both wrapped themselves in their towels and lifted their glasses for a toast. After that, they wanted to inspect every nook and cranny of the coach again, even sitting in the driver's seat. As it got dark outside, I picked up a remote control and started closing all the window coverings, but Lauren squealed with excitement, taking the remote from me to do it herself repeatedly. Then Kathy did the same. I smiled and grabbed another remote, playing with the interior lights. The two of them laughed and giggled as the LED lights changed the inside of the coach to an array of colors, each taking turns with the remote. After a while, Kathy put the remote on the counter. You must think we're acting like children. I laughed. It's okay. Experiencing these things on wheels is different from having them in your house. Just imagine taking a shower or cooking a meal while going down the highway at 70 miles an hour. Thanks for showing us this bus. It's incredible, Kathy said. It really is, Lauren added, then walked toward me and, with a playful smile, let her towel drop to the floor. You know, there's one more thing I'd like to do in here. How about starting a new club, the Bus Club? The rest of the evening was a whirlwind of excitement and new experiences. By the time they left the coach at 3 a.m, I was left alone to reflect on a night that had checked off a couple of items from my bucket list. And so it went for over a year. I delivered coaches and occasionally found myself in interesting situations. It never seemed to happen when I had an RV just with the coaches. During that time, I made 6 deliveries to Florida, our biggest market for these high-end coaches. On each trip, I made time to visit my parents, who reminded me that either Cheryl or her attorney had been asking repeatedly about my whereabouts. The last 3 times it was Cheryl herself who contacted them. She told them she was alone, broke, and desperate. My father, with little sympathy, simply responded, "That's too bad," without asking her how she ended up in that situation. I figured that if I was going to hear anything official, it would be around May or June after taxes were filed. If the courts wanted to find me, they could track me through my social security number and the IRS. But I heard nothing and began to feel relatively safe. Since starting that job, I had spent very little of my own money because the company covered nearly all of my expenses. Consequently, I had over a year's salary saved up, in addition to what I had before starting the job. I figured I couldn't deliver coaches forever, so I began planning the next stage of my life. Another year of what I was doing and I could almost buy a house outright, unless, of course, I moved to a ridiculously expensive city like San Francisco or New York. While Seattle was expensive, the Pacific Northwest still called to me. I had made several deliveries up there and really liked the area. The vast majority of vehicles we built were family or owner-driver coaches. These were typically driven by the owner and used primarily as vacation vehicles, usually sleeping 2 to 6 people, without isolating the driver's area from the rest of the coach. We also built coaches with a separate driver's area, typically for bands and singers. Some of these were designed for just the star and their close friends or family, while others were set up for the band, with bunk beds sleeping up to 12 people, plus a bathroom, kitchen, and space for eating, hanging out, writing songs, or playing games. These bands traveled the country, living in their coaches for months at a time. The star coaches generally cost at least $1 million, and with few exceptions, the stars themselves would come to the factory to take delivery. I had just gotten back from a delivery to Oregon, and was due to take a couple of days off. I was in the motel when my boss called. "Jason, I have a deal for you." That comment was right up there with "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you" in terms of evoking total and instantaneous suspicions. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to be sick that day." "What day? What the hell are you talking about? Every time you tell me you have a deal for me, I end up not having any time off because there's a coach that has to be delivered yesterday." That may have been true in the past, but trust me, you'll like this one. That was another of those comments that meant trouble, trust me. "Tom, I'm tired. I need a couple of days rest and I haven't had a vacation since I've been here." "What do you mean no vacation? You travel all the time and you've been to most of the 48 contiguous states. What more do you want?" I liked my job and, as mentioned, wanted to have it for at least another year, but except for the few visits I made to my parents' house, I hadn't lived in anything bigger than one room in a motel or hotel for well over a year. "Look," he said. "Do this for me and I promise you'll get some time off." Fuck, I thought. In the final analysis, he had been more than fair with me. "All right. Where does it have to be and when?" "It's going to Nashville, but this one is a little different." "Different?" I didn't like the sound of that. "Different how? And different why?" He chuckled. "Come see me." An hour later I was standing with him outside a newly completed coach. "Have you ever heard of Reagan Thompson? Isn't she a painter?" I had no idea who she was or if she painted or sold shoes and really didn't care. "Maybe, but I'm thinking of a different Reagan Thompson. The one I'm thinking about is one of the newest big music stars, and this is his coach. It's also his first personal one. He has been traveling with his band in a used coach he bought from another singer, but has decided he wants one just for himself and his family. That's not unusual for the bigger stars. We build 1 or 2 a year for them." "His coach? Isn't Reagan a girl's name?" "Not in this case. It doesn't matter." "What's the deal with his coach?" He took a deep breath. "He paid over $1 million for it, and he wants to drive it himself. He spent a lot of time writing on these things as he was developing a following, but now that he's a big star, he wants his own private one and he wants to drive it himself. The problem is, the biggest thing he's ever driven is an F-250 pickup truck, so he wants someone to teach him to drive it." He looked directly at me. "And he wants that person to be you." "Oh, I knew, you don't. There are more senior people than me, and more qualified." "What about Ryan?" "Tim Ryan? No can do. He wants you." "How can he want me? He doesn't even know me." "No, but he knows how you drive." "What do you mean?" "Remember a couple of months ago you took that band coach to the dealer in Chattanooga, but it was supposed to go to their Nashville location?" "Yeah." Well, Thompson had been in Chattanooga making a personal appearance. As he was driving home to Nashville, he got behind you on the interstate. Since he was getting his first coach soon, he thought he'd follow you just for fun. He followed you for 2 hours and was impressed by the way you drove, especially over Monteagle. What is Monteagle? I asked. It's a section of I-24 outside of Chattanooga. It isn't the longest, highest, or steepest mountain grade in the country, but for some reason, its long 6% descent is deceptive and treacherous, especially in inclement weather. Drivers tend to be a bit careless the first time they drive it. I never noticed it. That's because you had a jake brake. A jake brake is a system in large vehicles designed to help slow it without applying the brake pedal. It uses the compression of the engine to reduce blah blah blah. I don't know how the fucking thing works. All I know is when the vehicle starts to go down a hill, the driver just takes his, or her, foot off of the accelerator and it slows the vehicle without having to apply the brakes. If you've ever been near a big truck or bus/coach and heard a loud popping noise, it was probably the jake brake. It saves lots of wear on the braking systems of big, heavy vehicles. Anyway, this big star followed me. That's right. He liked the way you handled the coach in traffic and decided that he wanted you to teach him to drive his. He saw the name of the coach and knew it was the same company building his, so he decided to see if the driver, that would be you, could teach him. He's going to California to make his first movie and thought it would be nice to go out there in his new coach. You're joking. Do I act like I'm joking? I'm really not qualified to. Damn it, Jason. He spent over $1 million fucking dollars and he wants you to help him. It's no big deal. All you have to do is take the coach to Nashville, pick up him and his family, take them to California and teach him to drive on the way. He rushed through the last part of his statement, then turned away from me. I looked at him. Excuse me. What did you just say? He turned back to me. You heard me. He wants you to bring the coach to Nashville. I understand that part. It's the next part one don't care for. The taking him to California part. Are you serious? Is he serious? He's serious enough to pay you $5,000 for a week's work. Plus a first-class flight back here when you get them there. That was a pretty impressive number and got my attention. Okay. Suppose I do this. How many of his family will be going and how many does this thing sleep? Him, his wife, their 2 children and his sister. The coach sleeps 6, but you won't be sleeping in the coach, you'll be sleeping in motels. It should take you about 3 or 4 days if everything goes right. His people will make arrangements for motels every day depending on how far you get. He paused and looked at me. Come on, Jason. What do you have to lose? You're getting a lot of money to spend time with a famous star. It can't be all bad, can it? He was right, of course. When do I leave? As soon as you can get ready. He's anxious to get started. Okay. I'll leave in the morning. Good. Let's stop in the office and Kat will give you his personal phone number and address. He wants you to call him when you get a couple of hours away from his place. I spent the rest of the day familiarizing myself with everything on that $1 million coach. I had never towed a car, but was concerned that Reagan Thompson might want to do that, so I asked Kat to call him and see if he wanted us to do that. Mr. Thompson, this is Kat again. Jason is here and he has a question for you. There was a pause. Okay. Here he is. She handed the phone to me. This is Jason. Jason. Good to speak with you. I'm Reagan. What's your question? Were you planning on towing a car on our little jaunt? Nah. The studio is furnishing a car for us, so I don't need one of mine. Good, that makes it a bit easier. When you practice backing the coach, we won't have to unhook and hook the car. He chuckled. I had the same thought. How long do you think it will take us? Depends on you, I suppose, and how much time you want to spend taking smaller back roads and driving through cities. Why would we do that? I thought we'd get on I-40 and haul ass. Anybody can get on the interstate and haul ass, but small roads in cities is where you learn to drive. You're right, and I know it. I want to do it right if I'm going to do it. When will you be here? I'm leaving in the morning and it's about 600 miles, so why don't we say day after tomorrow? I can be there anytime you want. Okay, let's call it 9 in the morning. You can show me around the coach and we can pack it. We'll leave the next morning. Sounds good. See you then. When I arrived in Nashville, I checked into a motel for the night. The next morning at 9 the gates opened as I turned into the long, wide driveway. Next to the 5-car garage was an apparently new, much larger garage which, I assumed, had been built to accommodate the coach. I stopped directly in front of it. His wife, mother, father, sister, 2 children, and about a dozen other people were there when I pulled in. There was lots of cheering and yelling as I set the brakes, opened the door, and got out just before all of them clambered on board and scampered through the coach, opening drawers, checking out the fridge, sitting in the driver's seat, and on and on. Reagan was the only one to introduce himself. I Googled him before I left, so knew what he looked like, but was still surprised to see him in real life. "Hello, Jason. Have any trouble finding it?" he asked as he shook my hand. "No trouble at all." "Wow. I've seen it on video and pictures, but it's gorgeous in real life," he said as he looked at his coach. "Wait until you see inside." Inside, everyone started asking where this was, how that worked, and on and on. The 2 children, 6-year-old twin boys, loved their bunk beds with individual TV and sound systems. He shooed everybody out and I spent the next 3 hours going through the whole thing for him. He had a professional videographer go along with us as I explained how everything worked, especially the central control panel, all of the remote control devices, and the driver's area. He wanted to be able to go back and review the video whenever he had a question about how something worked. He also had some tape and marked each remote and what it controlled. He was very detail-oriented and asked all the right questions in the correct order. I was impressed, but then anyone who spent that much money would want to know as much as he could. After the orientation, he led me to one of the 2 patios his house had and where a caterer had put out a lunch spread. It was there I formally met his family. His wife, Pat, was very nice and held my arm as she took me around and introduced me to everyone, including his band members who had shown up sometime during my orientation with Reagan, which is what he insisted I call him. It was mid-afternoon when Reagan's wife Pat and his sister, Kelly, started moving boxes into the coach. Bedding, linen, towels, food, dishes, and everything a house needed to function was moved in and stowed. It was apparent they had given lots of thought to what they might need. I asked if I could get a ride back to the motel for the evening. He offered to let me spend the night there, but all my stuff was at the motel, so I declined. He and I went to the garage and he used his code to open the door. The first vehicle I saw was a Range Rover. Reagan went to a board on the wall, took a set of keys, tossed them to me and told me he'd see me in the morning. "What time do you want to leave?" I asked. 7 too early? Works for me. If you're here at 6 we can have breakfast before we go. Great. See you at 6. As happened the day before, the gates opened as I turned into the driveway. I learned later that there was a camera that alerted the house when someone turned in and they could open the gate. The coach hadn't moved since I parked it the night before, not that I expected it to have. Reagan met me at the garage. We had a hurried breakfast because they were all anxious and excited about getting started. "Are you ready to go?" Reagan asked. "Always. How about you?" "Let's go." "Want me to put the Range Rover away?" I asked. "Nah. One of my guys will take care of it. Let's hit the road." "Would you like to drive?" I asked him. "Oh. No. I'll wait until we get on the interstate." Pat sat in the passenger seat and Reagan sat on a stool beside me and looked over my shoulder, out the windshield, and at both outside mirrors for 3 hours, constantly asking questions about why did I do this, or why did I do that. "Okay. I think I'm ready," he announced. We pulled into the next rest area where I shut it completely down and then had him talk me through the start-up procedure as he did it. He had learned well. His initial takeoff was smooth as silk. His first attempts at using the air brakes, however, almost sent all of us through the windshield. Driving down the interstate in a beautiful coach will get you attention, but doing it at 50 miles an hour will get you a lot more than you want when all other traffic is doing 80. Lots of horns let the frustration of other drivers be known. It took almost an hour before he was up to highway speeds and another hour before he began to relax. The first time he passed a semi, his knuckles were white and he was sweating, but he did it. He drove a lot that first day, even when we got off the highway to go to the motel. He asked me to pull in the lot and park it, however. There was a restaurant next to the motel and we all went there for dinner. I sat next to Kelly and we had a chance to chat for the first time. I learned she was divorced and lived with her brother. Their family was originally from Cleveland and she had graduated from the Ohio State University with a degree in mass communications. When Reagan started becoming a rising star, he and Pat moved to Nashville. He asked Kelly to move with them because he knew he could rely on her to take care of his schedule in press and public relations. By the time we got to California, I was just a passenger and spent most of my time sitting on the sofa with Kelly. The twins spent most of their time in their bunk beds and Pat was in the passenger seat. It took 5 days because we spent time off the interstate and even spent 2 nights in RV parks just so they could learn to set up and use the coach as a camper. On one of those nights, Kelly and I slept in the recliners after staying up most of the night talking. The other night we fell asleep on the sofa and awoke in each other's arms. Reagan had lots of phone calls on the trip and used the newly developed hands-free feature a lot. I couldn't help but overhear most of his conversations and learned a lot about the music industry as well as some good investment info he and his money manager exchanged. I took notes and used the investment information to my advantage. In California, Reagan confidently maneuvered through the city to the house the studio had provided for him. He invited me to spend the first night with them. I said I would because it would probably be the last time I saw any of them and we had developed friendships. I met several of the studio biggies when they came to the house to meet with Reagan. After they left and it was just the family and me again, Kelly made my reservation for my flight the next day and arranged to have a car take me to the airport. Just as Reagan and Pat left for bed, Pat hugged me and Reagan gave me an envelope and thanked me for my help and time. Kelly and I talked until 2 in the morning, and when we finally parted to go to bed, we kissed. The next morning, 2 cars arrived simultaneously, one to take Reagan and Pat to the studio and the other to take me to the airport. I said my goodbyes and kissed Kelly. Reagan and Pat were surprised, and Reagan quipped, "Maybe we shouldn't be saying goodbye. Looks like we might be seeing you again." We all laughed. "Will I be seeing you again?" Kelly asked. "Do you want to?" "Of course." "Then you will." True to Tom's promise, my flight home was first class. Later that day, I was back in Texas, giving Tom a full report. He told me that the promised $5,000 would be in my next paycheck. This reminded me of the envelope Reagan had given me. I took it out, opened it, and found a check for another $5,000, along with a note, "Jason, thank you for your help. Your bosses don't have to know about this check. Reagan." I laughed and showed it to Tom. "Looks like you had a pretty lucrative week," Tom joked. Life returned to normal, and 2 days later, I was off to Florida with another coach. Kelly and I talked several times during that trip, and when I reached Florida, I spent the night with my parents, telling them all about her. They knew of Reagan's music and were fans. Over the next 2 months, Kelly and I talked often, and I was planning to fly out to see her. However, a coach delivery to her area came up, so I took it, disregarding our 500-mile-per-day driving rule. I spent 2 days with her and saw Reagan and Pat a few times. They weren't surprised to see me. Long-distance relationships are challenging, and ours had some low points. Despite these, I turned down several women curious about the coaches I was delivering. Kelly and I hadn't gone beyond kissing, but I remained faithful. Our lowest point came during an unexpected trip to California when I could only stay one night, a night Kelly had plans. It shocked me to learn she was dating others, and our calls after that became dull and routine. I started showing women the insides of the coaches again, and my sex life returned to what had been normal for me. Reagan, his family, and Kelly were scheduled to be in California for 5 months, but during my last trip, I learned they were returning to Nashville the following week. The calls eventually stopped. Kelly became a distant memory. She was a nice lady, but not someone I had a significant relationship with. Several months later, my parents called to say they had received a letter from an attorney addressed to me. My father said he returned it to the mailman, unopened, assuming it was from Cheryl's attorney. "What are you going to do about her?" my father asked. "You can't hide forever." I laughed. "I don't think of it as hiding, more like staying out of her line of sight." "You can't do that forever," he repeated. "I know, Dad. I'll see what I can do." After our call, I turned on my old phone and called my attorney, whom I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. He was surprised to hear from me and immediately reminded me that I owed him money. "I thought I paid you before I left," I said. "You did, for the divorce. But not for that shenanigan you pulled." "What shenanigan?" He laughed. "You know, collecting the insurance money on the house and skipping town." "Oh, that shenanigan. Yeah, that one, so before we go any farther, you owe me." He took a couple of minutes to check his files, then he told me the amount. "Holy shit. Why that much?" "You're the owner of record of the property where the house was, and just because you paid the mortgage and left didn't mean you didn't still have responsibilities. You left a pile of ashes and debris on the property and the city found it to be unsightly and wanted it removed, plus you were still liable for the taxes. The city couldn't find you, but they found me, so I paid to have the debris hauled away, the property cleaned up, planted some grass, paid insurance just in case someone got hurt playing on the property, and I paid the taxes. I've also paid to keep the grass cut. I assumed you'd show up sooner or later, and if you didn't, I'd figure out a way for me to get the property. Okay, I'll pay, but I need some Advic." Ha! That's a good one. You didn't seem to need it when you really needed it. "I'm sorry, but I had a reason." "Yeah, and I know what that reason was. I read the decree and I'm not stupid." "Then we both know that I got royally screwed. She had no right to my house, and then to move that asshole in with her. I thought I saw my way out and took it. Well, I want you to know that your little ploy worked. Her attorney called me and was mad as hell. They tried for months to contact you and see when you were going to build a new house or get her another one. Or rather, they moved into an apartment and kept looking for you. Your parents were no help when she asked them how to contact you. Early on, her attorney talked to the judge who issued the decree and wanted you found and arrested. The judge, came to me and asked if I knew where you were. I told him that I had no idea, and repeated attempts by me to contact you failed because apparently your phone was no longer active. I also told him that I assumed you interpreted the decree as requiring you to only provide that specific house at that specific address, and when, or if, it no longer existed, neither did your obligation. He told me that while he agreed with that interpretation, we all knew that wasn't his intention. The law gave him very little latitude and he was basically required to rule the way he did. His relatively new clerk screwed up the verbiage and he failed to sufficiently proofread it before he signed and published it. I asked him what happens now. His response was that he couldn't go back and change the published decree. He then added that once in a great while a miscarriage of justice was rectified by karma. Then he winked at me. It took me a couple of seconds to fully understand what he had just told me. So what does that mean? Am I free of any obligation to her? It appears you are. She went back to court to challenge the decree and the Court of Appeals refused to hear the case, so as far as the court is concerned, it's a done deal. And the property? It's obviously still there and you still own it, thanks to me. He gave me his bank information and I made arrangements to transfer funds to reimburse him, and I told him that I would be coming home to look around. I then talked to my boss and brought him up to date. After my next delivery, I could take some time off. That delivery took me to Nashville. I had just pulled into the dealership with another band bus. They were all coaches, but those built for the bands all seemed to be called band buses. When my phone rang, I saw who was calling. "Hello, Kelly." "Hi, Jason. You didn't just pull into the motorhome dealership, did you?" "As a matter of fact, I did." "Why?" "I was just driving by and saw one pull in. It made me think of you, so I called." "How are you?" "Great. Thank you. How are you?" "Great, too. Listen, would you like to have lunch? Or dinner? Sure, why not? This shouldn't take long. Give me 30 minutes. I'll pick you up. It was not a long lunch, just some time with a friend, and we parted with a hug. I didn't fly out of Nashville until the next day, so spent the evening trying to decide what I had gained from my relationship, such as it was, with Kelly. I determined that it wasn't so much her and my relationship as it was Reagan's and mine. He and I had chatted off and on over the months when he had a question about his coach. This happened, so what do I do, or can I do? It had lots of programs and functions, and he was very conscientious about learning and maintaining his expensive toy. He did some shows in Florida and invited my parents to one of them. He met them and spent some time with them and his coach. They loved that. They also met Kelly, and the next time they talked with me, told me they liked her and wanted to know what happened between us. No spark, was my answer. After that delivery, I flew back to the factory, told my boss I needed some time off, loaded my car and drove home. I didn't know what I was going to do or how long I was going to stay, so got a motel room for a week. They say you can never go home again, but it was nice to be back. The first place I went was to see my property. It was nothing but a green patch where some kids were playing, but it was mine, and I had a fleeting thought about what it would be like to live there again. I'd always liked the neighborhood and the neighbors. I was watching the kids play when the tapping on my window came. I was deep in thought and was startled. It was the next-door neighbor, Dan Franklin. Dan was my parents' age and had lived there as long as I could remember. "Hey, Jason. I thought that was you. How've you been?" he asked. I got out of my car, shook his hand, and smiled. "Pretty fair, Mr. Franklin. How about yourself?" "I've been worse." "What brings you back here?" "I'm not sure. Just fighting demons and relishing good memories, I suppose." "Have time for coffee? We can share some of the demons and memories if you want." 10 minutes later, we were in his kitchen, the same kitchen I'd been in many times. As a youngster, I watched him always put a shot of Bailey's in his coffee and wondered what it would taste like. Once I was old enough to try it, I never stopped. The memories were the first items of discussion, but it didn't take long for the demons to make an appearance. They started with his opinion of Cheryl and Richard Herbert. He apparently moved in right after I moved out, and the neighborhood was not the same after that. He and Cheryl started fighting almost immediately, and it seemed to disrupt the whole neighborhood. Cheryl was not disliked while I lived there, but apparently she changed when he moved in. She stopped talking to neighbors and didn't participate in any neighborhood-type functions or social gatherings. He, on the other hand, just flat-out made enemies and argued with everyone he met. He was not a very nice guy generally. The day the house burned down, Herbert came running out of the house with a guitar and computer, and he never went back in. He did call out for Cheryl to see if she was okay, but made no effort to go back in to see if she needed help getting out. When she did come out, flames were shooting out of the downstairs windows and she was carrying her jewelry boxes and photo albums. Herbert was heard to yell at her for bringing her stuff and not his favorite leather jacket and cowboy boots. They were still arguing as the neighborhood watched the house burn. Mr. Franklin chuckled as he told me he heard Cheryl call him a stupid shithole for trying to move the deep fry cooker outside. Apparently, when the rain stopped, he tried to move the deep frying of the turkey outside, but tripped in the process, knocking it over. I remembered there had been rumors to that effect. There was not much left by the time the fire department arrived. Both Cheryl and Herbert came by the next day to see if there was anything to save, but left without taking anything. Mr. Franklin had seen Cheryl around town a few times, but never Herbert. He asked if I was going to stay in town and if I was going to build a new house. I've thought about it, but I'm afraid that if I did rebuild, she would get it. Our divorce decree specifically refers to the house at this address. If I rebuild, she might be able to pull out the decree and claim it. I'm not going to take that chance. That's too bad, but let me ask if you would consider selling the land? My grandchildren and the rest of the neighborhood kids love playing there. If you sell it to me, my wife and I will put up some playground equipment and make it a park. An hour later, we had struck a deal. I liked that city, but no longer had much of a reason to stay. I went back to my motel and was packing my stuff in preparation for leaving in the morning. I called my boss and told him I'd be back in 3 days and ready to work. We all have favorite places to do things, eat, shop, vacation, etc. My favorite place in town to eat was a little bar that served food not normally associated with bars, Osso Buco, for example. Not that I was a big fan of Osso Buco specifically, but I was of good food. One of my favorites at that bar was a dish I had never seen on any other bar's menu, chicken marbella. I had just ordered it and sensed someone towering over me. I thought the server had come back for something. I looked up and Cheryl stood there. "You're an asshole," she said. "And you're a slut," I countered. "I hope you don't plan on standing there while I eat because I certainly don't intend to invite you to sit. That would ruin an otherwise perfectly good meal. How could you do it, Jason? How could you just walk away and leave me without a place to live? Just exactly what do you think you did to me? I was kicked out of my house and left with no place to live because you and another asshole thought you were in love, so you fucked up my life and stole my house." "Stole it, Cheryl. Flat out fucking stole something that you had no right to. I know, the court did it officially, but you started it. It was mine, too, Jason. It was never yours. It was my home for most of my life. You never lived there long enough to change the sheets on the bed. Then you met an old flame and convinced the court that we had irreconcilable differences. Exactly what does that mean, anyway? You couldn't define it, much less name one. The court saw it differently. Only because of the fucked up laws that were designed to screw husbands like me who never did anything wrong except marry cheating sluts. That's not my fault. The law said it was mine, so I took it. Fine. It's yours. Enjoy what's left of it. Fuck you. You already did. Now go away." She sat. "No, actually," she plopped. "You owe me and I want it. I don't owe you shit. I did exactly what the divorce decree ordered me to do. Nothing more. Nothing less. If you don't like it, take it up with the court." "Oh, that's right. You already did and lost. It's not my fault your forever love tripped over his own footprint and burned the house to the ground. Now just go away. Not until I get what I deserve." I started laughing and pointed to the big window at the front of the bar. "If you got what you really deserve, a big truck would come crashing through that window and knock you into the middle of next week." I almost said coach instead of truck, but I didn't want to soil their image. She changed her tack. "Jason, I have nothing. Richard left me after the fire and I have been living with my parents. I need help. I couldn't care less what you need. Get another job. Go to school. Find another forever love, but you're getting nothing from me." I stood. "Now thanks to you I don't feel like eating. Once again you fucked up my life. Stay away from me, Cheryl. Life is too short to be ruined by the likes of you." I went to my server, handed him enough money to cover the cost of my meal. This should be enough to cover my tab. I don't have an appetite anymore. He laughed and pushed my hand away, ignoring the money. "Keep it," he said. "I should pay you for the entertainment you just provided." I walked out to the sound of applause which, I assumed, came from men who had been screwed by ex-wives in the courts. I'm normally relatively calm and stay pretty much on an even, rational keel. I don't yell, scream, throw things, or wish physical harm to anyone, but until that evening, I had not really had an opportunity to express my feelings to Cheryl. Most people who know me would be shocked at the way I talked to her that time. To be frank, I was pretty shocked at myself, but even after I had time to reflect on it, I didn't regret it. It was cathartic. My first delivery after getting back to work took me to Seattle. I had been there several times delivering coaches and my initial instincts were confirmed. I liked the area as much, if not better, than any other part of the country I'd been to, and I'd been to most of them with the job. The service manager of the dealership was going over the coach I had driven in. He was the one who had to inspect it and sign the documentation of acceptance. I couldn't leave without that. While he was conducting his inspection, I was looking at a coach with the fanciest paint job I had seen in my history of coach association. Paint jobs for these coaches can reach upwards of $100,000, but I was willing to bet that the paint on that coach was much more. Do you think it would be okay if I looked inside? I asked the service manager. Sure. The owner won't mind. He's a nice old guy. Old? Did you just call me old? Said the gentleman who was laughing as he approached. One of these days, Sammy, you're going to go too far and I'm going to be pissed. And one of these days, Mr. Ferguson, you're going to learn to stop calling me Sammy. And you're going to remember that you aren't allowed back here in the service area. The minute I can't come back here to watch how you mistreat my overgrown SUV is the day I sell it back to you and go live in a home for old people, and don't you dare say that I'm already old. Sammy. Their banter was obviously that of friends who felt comfortable with each other. Mr. Ferguson came to me and stuck out his hand. Jacob Ferguson, but my friends call me Jake. That gentleman, he said pointing at Sammy, calls me Mr. Ferguson, because he never learned to respect his betters. He smiled broadly as we shook hands. Jason Truesdell. Pleased to meet you, sir. Don't call me sir. Only people like Sammy have to do that. It'll be a cold day in hell when I call you sir. You'll have to excuse him, Jason. He's both uncouth and uneducated, and the management of this establishment has to keep him back here and away from the public, otherwise he'd chase all their business away. He paused. Did I hear you ask if you could look inside my overgrown SUV? You did. I smiled. I'd never heard any of our coaches referred to as an overgrown SUV before. Do you have one of your own? Oh, no. I just deliver them. Deliver them? So I told him what I did. Sounds like a fun job. Well, come on. Let's peek inside. He was obviously very proud as he showed me around. I had seen several coaches at the factory in the $1 million range, and, of course, I had driven Reagans. I had also seen several that were close to $2 million, but they were rare. Mr. Ferguson's had to have been in that price range, and it was at least 2 years old because I had never seen it. There were lots of curvy cabinets made of rare, exotic woods, and the floor was real marble, as were the countertops, bathroom walls, and showers. Yes. Showers. There were 2 of them, one in each of the 2 bathrooms. Coaches with 2 bathrooms were also rare. My wife and I hate to share bathrooms, even with our children and grandchildren, so we have ours and everybody else has theirs. The engine was one of the biggest we put in our coaches. While 500 HP was pretty much the standard engine for coaches, this was a 605 HP monster, and as Mr. Ferguson proudly proclaimed, was a triple-digit coach. Triple-digit meant it would go over 100 miles per hour. I had frequently driven 80 and 85, and had one time gone 100. That was the time I found myself with several NASCAR trucks carrying the race cars and coaches carrying the crews and drivers. They were on their way to another race venue. I looked in my outside mirror and saw them coming in the hammer, left, lane. As the first one passed me, I accelerated. By the time the last one passed, I was up to speed with them, and I fell in line at the rear and found myself being the back door for them. In a convoy of vehicles, usually big trucks, the person in the lead is called the front door, the person at the rear is the back door. Everyone between those two is considered to be in the rocking chair because the front and back doors are responsible for looking for any law enforcement. Those in the rocking chair can just cruise along. We must have gone 75 miles at 100 miles per hour, almost bumper to bumper like the cars did during the races, and seemingly without fear of the law. In fact, we passed 2 highway patrol cars going in the opposite direction. They both hit their blue lights for a couple of seconds as if to warn us, but the front door never slowed down and we just kept hauling ass. That was exciting and a hell of a lot of fun. Mr. Ferguson and I had been in his coach about 15 minutes when Sammy brought my paperwork. Tell me when you're ready to go and we'll get you a ride to the airport, he said. Mr. Ferguson, if you leave my mechanics alone, you'll be ready to go in about an hour. Thank you, Sammy, he said, smiling. Sammy just shook his head and left. What am I missing with the Sammy thing? I asked. He laughed again. He seemed to enjoy laughing. Our families go back a long way. He and my son, Mark, are best friends, and he spent a lot of time in our house while he was growing up. His name is Samuel, but prefers being called Sam. He hates Sammy and I'm the only one who gets by with calling him that. He calls me Mr. Ferguson because that's all he's ever called me and I can't convince him to call me Jake. Mark calls Sam's parents by their first names, but Sam just can't seem to do it. When Sam and Mark graduated from high school, they joined the army. Neither of them wanted college, and that was okay because neither family could afford it anyway. They stayed together and were in the same unit in Afghanistan. They had been there just a couple of months and got hit. They were both wounded and spent a month in hospital in Germany. For over 2 weeks we didn't know if they were going to live or die. Sam's parents, my wife, and I spent a whole month in Germany by their beds. While at the hospital, we did a lot of crying and praying, usually at the same time. When the boys recovered, they were medically discharged from the service and decided to share an apartment. They still do. We both thought our own thoughts for a minute or so before I continued. Without being too personal, you said neither family could afford college, but you have a high-dollar coach. What did you do? Win the lottery? No. I had an uncle in Louisiana and a few years ago they found gas on his property. A little old 100-acre piece of swampland, and all of a sudden he had more money than God. He died before he ever knew how much it was worth. Hell, they still don't know. My father and I were the only blood relatives he had, so he left everything to us. I'd always wanted a camper, so saw my chance and bought this. Good for you, but this is a step or two higher than just a camper. I got a bit carried away. It's a lot more than we'll ever need, but it was available and I was in the mood. My wife and I are still living in our same old house and are happy with it, but this damn thing was like a magnet. We saw it and wanted it. We bought the house next to ours, demolished it, and built a garage for it. The cost of the coach, the house we tore down, and the new garage cost about 8 times what our house is worth. Nobody ever accused us of being smart. We talked for another few minutes in the coach, then went to the showroom where they had drinks and refreshments. I had coffee and he had a cappuccino and we talked some more. I learned that both he and Sam's father, Pete, were carpenters. Pete still was. Jake played a lot of golf, fished, and traveled. I told him my story and he laughed his ass off about the house and insurance. He asked what I did before the divorce and I told him I was an electrician. I also told him that I was on my way to the Seattle area when I met Tim Ryan at the motel and detoured to deliver coaches. Are you going to do this forever? He asked. Actually, I've sort of given myself another year or so before I find a place to settle. Still thinking about this area? Probably. I've been all over the country with this job, and haven't found any place I like better. Shortly after that, Sam came and announced that the overgrown SUV was ready, so Mr. Ferguson got ready to leave. Did Sammy say you were going to the airport? Yes, but I won't fly out until tomorrow. I'm having dinner with friends, then going to a concert tonight. What concert is that? Reagan Thompson. He's a. Hell, I know who he is. My wife and daughter love him. We tried to get tickets, but they're sold out. She is pissed. You really like him? Hell, yes. We once drove 400 miles to see him. She's still trying to find tickets for tonight, but even the scalpers are sold out. How many tickets do you need? Why? Do you have extras? You'd make me a hero if you do. How many? 4. Me, my wife, daughter and son. My daughter's birthday is next week and we wanted to take her. I smiled and took out my phone. Mr. Ferguson just looked at me as I punched in some numbers. Hello, Jason. What's up? Hello, Reagan. A friend of mine has been trying to get tickets for your show tonight and hasn't been able to. Any chance you might have an extra 4 lying around? It's for his daughter's birthday. We might be able to come up with 4. How old is his daughter and what's her name? I'll find out. What's your daughter's name, Mr. Ferguson, and how old is she? It's Kathy and she's 30. Who are you talking to? Her name is Kathy and she's 30. I repeated into the phone. He laughed. I thought she might be younger. It's pretty unusual for a father to take his 30-year-old daughter anyplace, much less one of my shows. Shouldn't be a problem. Let me check with Kelly and she'll get back to you in a few minutes. How about you meeting us in the green room before the show instead of us going out to dinner? The caterer is putting on a big spread and we've invited some local bigwigs. Everyone would like to see you. Bring your friends by. I'd like to say hi to them. I smiled. We'll be there. Oh, hey, if there aren't any seats, your friends can watch from backstage. There's always a gaggle of folks back there anyway. I'll tell them. Thank you and we'll see you tonight. I ended the call, looked at Mr. Ferguson and smiled. How would you and your family like to meet Reagan Thompson? Are you shitting me? No, sir. He had heard my side of the conversation, so I filled him in on Reagan's side. Just like that? One little phone call and we're having dinner with Reagan Thompson? I can't believe it. Well, let's wait a few minutes and see what Kelly has to say, and I don't know that a buffet in an arena green room would qualify as dinner. And who's Kelly? His sister. You'll like her. Turns out he more than liked her, so did his son, Mark. The Fergusons picked me up at the hotel and we went to the arena. Scotty, Reagan's security man, met us at the entrance to the reserved parking area and let us in. The first thing Jake, I was calling him Jake by then, saw was Reagan's coach. When I introduced Kelly to the family, I could almost feel sparks flying between her and Mark. It was like they had known each other all their lives. My meeting Kathy Ferguson wasn't anywhere near that, but we seemed to take to each other as well. She was a police officer in their town, which was east of Seattle, and spent 8 hours a day patrolling the city streets. To say the evening went well would be a huge understatement. It ended with all of us sitting in Reagan's coach after the show, Mark and Kelly on the sofa, Kathy and me at the dining room table, and Jake in the driver's seat with Reagan in the passenger seat. Pat and Grace, Jake's wife, were standing over their husbands listening to them talk about coaches and looking really bored. Reagan, Pat, and Kelly were scheduled to leave the next morning, but decided they were going to stop by Jake and Grace's place before leaving town to look at their coach. The Fergusons dropped me off at the airport hotel, and Kathy and I took our time saying goodbye. The next few months were interesting. Every time I took off, I went to Seattle to be with Kathy. Mark was spending time on the road with Kelly, Reagan, and Pat. In fact, he had all but taken over the job of driving their coach, a coach which, incidentally, was for sale because after seeing Jake's, Reagan ordered a new one. I quit my job and moved my stuff to be near Kathy. As in my home state, I needed a license to work as an electrician. That meant getting a letter from the company where I worked as an electrician and a copy of my license from that state. I also had to take a test. All that took a little time I used to buy a house and furnishings. I bought my house in the same town Kathy and her family lived in. Kathy did most of the furnishing selection. I enjoyed being able to stretch out, as it were, and live in something larger than a motel or hotel room. The dealership I delivered to in Seattle had a driving program for new R/V and coach owners. They, or more specifically, Sammy, the service manager, asked if I would be interested in teaching new owners how to drive until I got my electrician's license, and even after if it worked out. I thought it was a good idea, so started doing it and enjoyed it. I had looked at the study guide for the electrical test and decided it was basically the same as the one I had taken and passed in my home state and wasn't too concerned about it, so was taking my time. But when Kathy said she would move in with me when I passed, my review of the study guide took on an urgency in a personal, erotic, self-centered way. 3 weeks later, I had a roommate and was never happier. My life was perfect. Mark and Kelly got married and settled in Nashville. Reagan found someone else to take care of his public relations and schedule. He also got his new coach, and he and Jake argue about which was nicer. Jake is trying to convince Grace they need a newer, nicer one. That would be okay with Kathy and me because we could take that one on trips like we take the current one. I am busy with my small 3-man company and Kathy still patrols the city streets. She will do that for another couple of weeks before she takes a hiatus to get married and have a baby.